Hello, Namaskar. This is First Post and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. More than 24 hours since Russia said Putin had survived an assassination attempt, we're tracking developments in the Ukraine war. As feared, the fighting has intensified. Explosions rocked multiple Ukrainian cities. A Russian oil refinery is on fire. Russia has launched a terror investigation into the drone attack and is now blaming America for plotting this. Tonight, we'll bring you the latest developments and the analysis. Also tracking the big story in India. The foreign ministers of SCO member countries are meeting in Goa. Leaders from Russia and China are here. So is Pakistan's Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, the first visit by a Pakistani foreign minister to India in more than a decade. We'll tell you what to expect. In the UK, the government is worried about protests during the King's coronation. So they've passed a law in record speed, an anti-protest law. Whatever happened to democracy and dialogue, we ask. And in the US, cases of child labor are on the rise and governments are making it easier for companies to employ children for lower wages. Details coming up, the headlines first. Sudan's truce in tatters as fighting rages on. The latest ceasefire expired at midnight on Wednesday. More than 500 people have been killed and nearly 5,000 injured in the weeks-long violence. The Arab League will hold an emergency meeting on Sudan on Sunday. US and the World Food Programme halt food aid to Ethiopia's Tigray. They say goods supplied to the war-torn region are being sold in local markets. There has been no major violence in the region after a peace deal was signed last November. Japan and South Korea try to reboot their relationship. Prime Minister Kishida will visit Seoul this weekend, the first such visit by a Japanese leader in more than a decade. The two countries seek to bury historical mistrust to counter North Korea. Amid a tug of war for global power and influence, the US will allow Chinese airlines to expand flights in a rare thaw. They can soon increase US passenger services to 12 weekly round trips. Big oil raking in record profit. Shell reports a $9.6 billion first quarter profit. This is higher than expected despite a slide in energy prices. Earlier this week, BP too recorded a nearly $5 billion first quarter profit. And is this the beginning of the end of passwords? Google has rolled out its passkey technology designed to replace passwords. Fingerprint ID, facial ID, or phone PIN can be used for authentication. Apple and Microsoft have already started using this technology. We start with the Russia-Ukraine war. It's intensifying. Last night we told you about the drone attacks on the Kremlin. Moscow said it was an assassination attempt on President Putin. Tonight we can tell you that the Russian retaliation has begun. Russia is going after not just Ukraine but the US too. The Kremlin today pretty much called Washington the mastermind of this attack. And it's striking Ukraine hard. Russia has launched a wave of drones and Ukrainian air defenses are working overtime to fend them off. It started with a bombshell of a claim from Russia that Ukraine had ordered an assassination bid on Vladimir Putin. Ukraine, though, has denied any role. Their President Zelensky is traveling through Europe, and this is what he had to say.
We don't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight on our territory. We are defending our villages and cities. We don't have, enough weapons for this.
Russia is having none of it, though. It has intensified airstrikes. Explosions were heard across Ukraine today, from Kiev to Zaporizhia, from Odessa to Kherson. Civilians reported loud blasts across Ukrainian cities. These attacks are being called revenge strikes. Some of the drones that fell in Odessa had inscriptions. They said, "For Moscow" and "For the Kremlin." So far, no serious casualties have been reported, but dozens are said to have been injured. People have been forced to move out of their homes. In Kherson, for example, scores of people were evacuated today. They left the city in buses. A 58-hour curfew has been imposed in Kherson. Those who haven't left are stocking up on food supplies and other essentials. What about Kiev? How is the Ukrainian capital faring? Locals are taking refuge in underground metro stations. They fear that Moscow will intensify attacks.
I don't think it was Ukraine that carried out the attack. The Russians tend to attack their own territory and then blame us, so that the West reacts and we turn out to be the aggressor instead of them.
Anything is possible. As long as Ukraine doesn't officially confirm that this was an attack carried out by us, there can be many theories as to who did it.
It isn't just Ukraine that's under attack, though. There was a drone strike in Russia, too. The target, an oil refinery in Krasnodar. This is in southern Russia. It's near a bridge that links mainland Russia with Crimea. Russian media says a drone struck this facility. Pictures from the ground show a huge blaze. Now, it's not clear what happened and who was behind it, but this is not a first. This region has seen such attacks before. Last weekend, for instance, there was another drone strike. This was at the Crimean port of Sevastopol. A Russian fuel storage facility was attacked. Moscow blamed Kiev for it. And in recent weeks and months, there have been a wave of such attacks. In some instances, drones came dangerously close to Moscow. Ukraine is believed to be behind these operations, but it's never taken responsibility for any of this. Now, Russia says there was an assassination bid on their president, and they won't take it lying low. Moscow has ordered an investigation. They've set up a committee for this. And they're calling this drone attack a terrorist act. And they're also blaming the US for it. The Kremlin says the plot to assassinate Putin was hatched in the US.
These attempts to disown this, both by Kiev and by Washington, are of course absolutely ridiculous. We know very well that decisions about such actions, about such terrorist attacks, are made not in Kiev but in Washington. And Kiev does what it is told to. We know that often even the goals themselves are not determined by Kiev, but they're determined in Washington and then taken to Kiev so that Kiev implements them. Not every time Kiev is given the right to choose means. This is also often dictated from across the ocean. We know this well and we are aware of this. To divide them by two or not, it does not matter to us. But in Washington, they must clearly understand we know this, that they are behind the attack.
What do you think was America's response? The White House has called the Kremlin's comment, quote unquote, ridiculous. As for the assassination claim, the US says it cannot confirm Russia's version. Listen to this.
So we are aware of the reports, but are unable to confirm the authenticity of them at this time. And so I don't want to get into speculation from here about what happened, but we are indeed aware of the reports.
The US State Department also said something on similar lines, which is a bit strange because, come to think of it, a country like America, with its vast intelligence apparatus, cannot make up its mind on what happened here. What about Zelensky? What is the Ukrainian president up to? While his citizens are under attack, Zelensky has extended his trip to Europe. Yesterday he was in Finland. Today he was in The Hague. He visited the International Criminal Court, the ICC, the same court that issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin. The ICC is investigating alleged Russian war crimes. The perfect platform for Zelensky to deliver yet another speech. Today he accused Russia of 6,000 war crimes. You heard that right, 6,000 war crimes. Zelensky said Ukraine did not choose this war, but Kiev will make it the last conflict.
Of course, we all want to see different Vladimir here in The Hague. The one who deserves to be sentenced for these criminal actions right here in the capital of the international law. And I'm sure we will see that happen when we win. And we will win.
So far, Zelensky's speeches have failed to move the needle. This war is set to intensify. Russia is hitting back hard. Ukraine is planning a counteroffensive. By the looks of it, we can expect more fighting in the days ahead. But Ukraine is just one battlefield. At the end of the day, this is a larger conflict between Russia and the West. It is as much a political fight as a military one. And it has many dimensions and flashpoints. One of them is the Nord Stream, the gas pipeline between Russia and Europe. The one that was sabotaged last year. The pipeline was blown up. It's not clear by whom. In the months that followed, we've seen claims and counterclaims. Multiple suspects have emerged. Pro-Ukrainian groups, the United States of America, Russia, they've all been blamed. Yet we do not know who did it. And now there is fresh evidence to add to the confusion, courtesy Denmark. Their military says that they have some photos. They haven't released the photos yet, but reports say these photos show ghost Russian vessels near the pipelines. They were there just 4 days before the explosions. And this is a new twist in the Nord Stream saga. We'll tell you what we know, starting with some context. The Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged on the 26th of September last year, 26 September 2022. Look at these pictures that came out immediately after the explosion. The water above the pipelines was bubbling. Below the surface, there had been underwater explosions. The Nord Stream has 4 pipelines. They supplied gas from Russia to Germany. Out of the 4, 3 pipelines were blown up. And these were powerful explosions. They were detected by nearby seismology stations. This, like I said, happened on the 26th of September. 4 days before this, on the 22nd of September, a Danish vessel was in the sea. This was a patrol vessel. It was called P524 Nymphen. Now, reports say this patrol vessel took 112 photographs. It spotted several Russian vessels near the blast site. And what did Denmark see? Apparently, there was a unique Russian vessel here. It was called the SS-750. And the presence of this vessel raised suspicions because this vessel can be equipped with a small submarine. Apparently, Denmark has 26 photographs of this specific Russian ship. And there's more. This comes from Nordic public broadcasters. Apparently, there are 3 Russian ships near the sites. There were 3 Russian ships near the blast sites. Reports say these were special ships and they could perform underwater operations. The vessels sailed with their position transmitters off, but their movements were being tracked. How? By radio communications from Russian naval bases. I know what you're thinking. The story just keeps getting murkier. I'll try and declutter it. Was this the first time that Russian ships were in these waters? Certainly not. Russian maritime activity is not unusual in the Baltic Sea. They conduct patrols and military exercises all the time. Russia has economic interests in the region, so it's not rare to find Russian ships here. What about Denmark's evidence? Well, the photographs are hardly a smoking gun. They are at best circumstantial evidence. And they're not even out in the public domain, so it's hard to make an assessment. Multiple probes are underway to ascertain what really happened to the Nord Stream pipeline. Different players are approaching this from different angles. Russia blames the West. The US is looking into the Ukrainian angle. They claim that pro-Ukrainian groups were responsible. Germany is conducting its own investigation. It is focused on a yacht. It's called Andromeda. Apparently, it was used to conduct this sabotage operation. There were 6 people on it. Some of them apparently had Ukrainian passports, and Germany believes that they may have sabotaged the Nord Stream. And what's making this worse is the silence of all these investigators. The probes began months back, but in all this time, officials have not said anything officially. And until they do, everything is in the realm of speculation, and new theories will keep adding to the confusion. All eyes are on Goa today, and no, it's not what you're thinking. There is no concert or beach party. Goa is hosting a major diplomatic meeting. The SCO foreign ministers are in town. SCO is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. New Delhi is chairing the SCO this year, so all major summits will be held in India. This one is the foreign ministers' meeting. Most of the delegates have already arrived in Goa, but there is one around whom there's a lot of interest. Bilawal Bhutto Zardari. He is the foreign minister of Pakistan. Bhutto landed in Goa around evening. He was careful to depict this visit as multilateral and not bilateral. Listen to the statement before his departure. During my visit, which is focused exclusively on the SCO, I look forward to constructive discussions with my counterparts from friendly countries. India feels the same. Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar is holding bilateral meetings with most of his counterparts in Goa. He's already met the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers, but a meeting with Bhutto is unlikely, at least a formal one. Jaishankar said last month that talks in terror. Nonetheless, you can understand the symbolism around it. The last time a Pakistani foreign minister visited India was in 2011. It's been more than a decade. So Bhutto's visit has stirred some excitement. The Goa summit is a 2-day event. Today was all about settling in. Minister Jaishankar also hosted a dinner for the foreign ministers, but tomorrow is business day, which brings us to the most important question. What is on the agenda? India's SCO presidency theme is secure. S for security, E for economic development, C for connectivity, U for unity, R for respecting sovereignty, and E for environmental protection. SECURE. Pretty much covers everything. But what are the key issues and deliverables? Reports say 15 proposals will be cleared by the foreign ministers. These will be forwarded to July for the main summit. That's when the heads of state, SCO heads of state and government will gather in India again. I'll list out some of the important issues. One is a national payment system, a mechanism to trade in local currencies within the SCO. It's a very ambitious project. Reports say talks are only in the initial stages. Another issue is of the expansion of the SCO. Belarus and Iran's membership will be discussed by the foreign ministers. So will observer status for Kuwait, the UAE, Myanmar and the Maldives. Speaking of Myanmar, some interesting developments there. The Chinese foreign minister made a stop in Myanmar before reaching Goa. He also met the leader of the military junta. Why is this important? Because China has always eyed influence in Myanmar. It has provided weapons for the junta, invested billions in the country's infrastructure, not to mention offered legitimacy for the regime. No other country has recognized the military rulers of Myanmar. So a meeting with the Chinese foreign minister is a big deal. But what do they get in return? A direct access to the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. And it's a strategic concern for India, one that extends to the SCO. You see, most countries in this organization are Chinese allies. Beijing sees the SCO as a tool to undermine the West, just like it sees the BRICS. And that leaves India in a pickle. New Delhi does not want to be stuck in a Chinese boys' club. At the same time, it doesn't want to lose out on opportunities presented by the SCO. This is a group that makes up around 30% of the world's GDP, 17.5% of global trade, and 42% of the global population. Plus, it could be India's window to Central Asia. So the challenge is to strike a balance, to use the SCO where it suits New Delhi. Hence the secure agenda. India has tried to push the SCO beyond just security and strategy. There is now focus on economic and cultural cooperation. And that balancing act will be challenged tomorrow. The discussions will inevitably cover Ukraine and Western sanctions. Those will be the tricky issues to navigate. We'll be tracking this summit closely. Just one more day for the coronation. The UK government is equal parts excited and worried. Excited for the new king, worried because he's not so popular. Republican groups are planning a big protest on Saturday. At least 1,000 people will hit the streets. It promises to be a PR disaster for London, and you can see why. There's a camera and a journalist on every street. If there's a protest, they will capture it. And that's what Britain is trying to avoid. How? By implementing a new anti-protest law. It was being debated for a long time, but on Wednesday, the UK government fast-tracked it. Talk about perfect timing. The coronation is on Saturday and the law gets implemented on Wednesday. But if you ask the British government, they say it's a coincidence. So what exactly does this law say? There are 3 things that you should know. Number 1, if you block roads, airports or railways, you get 12 months in jail. That is the maximum punishment. Number 2, if you cling on to buildings or people, you could get 6 months in jail, plus unlimited fine. And number 3, the police can stop and frisk suspects. How do you define suspects? Well, the cops decide that. This hurried decision by the UK government reveals 2 things. A, they're scared of the Republicans. The Home Office has even written a letter to them. It warns against disrupting public events. And B, Britain's utter hypocrisy on public protests. The Security Minister has defended this new law. He says it won't curb demonstrations. Listen to this. Anti-monarchists would still have the liberty to protest, but they would not have the liberty to disrupt others. That's where we are drawing a difference. Well, nothing wrong with that. Protests do tend to spiral out of control. One moment, there is a peaceful sit-in. The next thing you know, your biggest highway is blocked. Stuff like that is a headache for common people. Plus, it doesn't actually solve anything. So putting reasonable restrictions on protests is not really wrong. I underline the word reasonable. But Britain was not so understanding when protests happened elsewhere. You may remember the farmer protests in India. One of the key roads near the national capital was blocked. What was Britain's response then? They decided to debate the issue in the House of Commons. British MPs criticised India's handling of the protests. The year was 2021. Now imagine the opposite happening. Imagine the Indian Parliament debating Britain's new anti-protest law, or Indian MPs defending the rights of Republican protesters. It won't happen because it's absurd, because it's none of New Delhi's business. Western countries love to lecture on freedoms and democracies, but within their borders, they love cracking down. Remember these pictures from Canada? They're from last year's anti-vax protests. Justin Trudeau's cops were on a rampage. They used tear gas and batons to disperse the protesters. Now, we don't agree with their cause, but we have to ask, what happened to Trudeau? In 2021, he advised India to use democracy and dialogue. The very next year, he forgot both. Same with France right now. The pension protests are never ending. There is violence and destruction on the streets of Paris, but how many times has President Macron met the protesters? Did he prefer talks, or did he bulldoze the law through parliament? He did the latter. Macron stuck to his reform. He is even targeting journalists who took part in the protest. Last month, a French publisher was arrested in London. He was held on charges of terrorism. His crime? Taking part in the pension protests. It tells you a lot about Western double standards. And we're not saying that their restrictions are wrong. Blocking roads is indeed a public hassle. So is destroying property or peddling vaccine hesitancy. We are saying measure every country by the same yardsticks. If blocking roads in Britain is not okay, why is it okay in New Delhi or Colombo or Bangkok? Anti-monarchy protests have really exposed Britain's insecurity. For all the talk of royal solidity, they're scared. Scared about 1,000 odd protesters on Coronation Day. Now, I've seen governments defend new laws and reforms against public backlash. It happens all the time in democracy. But in London, the government is defending the past, something they did not start, and something they have no plans to end. Now for our next story, let's make a list. How many things do you pay for on a daily or monthly basis? And I'm not talking about food or water, I'm talking about services. Chances are you pay for ad-free music or ad-free streaming or OTT services like Netflix or Amazon. It's a no-brainer for most of us. We like the service, so we pay. Why not do the same for news? Most people read news online nowadays. Around 72% Indians get their updates from smartphones. 86% in America and again 72% in Europe. Almost all of that news is free. All you have to do is go on Google or YouTube or Twitter. Just think of this show that you're watching right now. Chances are you're seeing it on YouTube. Did you have to pay for it? No. And some governments are now trying to change this. Canada is the latest. They're close to implementing a new online news policy. This policy will force internet companies to pay publishers. How does that work? Assume you run a news website. Until now, your articles were free of cost online. You could find them on Google. You could read them on Google. But under this new law, Google would have to pay you, the publisher I mean. Let's say $100. If Google pays, they will be allowed to display links to your website. If not, those links can be taken down. Your website would become invisible on Google. So here's what Canada is trying to do. It wants internet companies to strike commercial deals with publishers. Pay them to keep their content online. Just one problem though. The internet companies are pushing back. Google and Meta are threatening to limit services in Canada. They say they will simply stop offering news. And that's trouble on two counts. One, it will hurt the publishers and journalists. And two, news should never be limited. It's a key part of any thriving democracy. So what's the solution here? Luckily, we have seen this situation before. It happened in Australia back in 2021. Their government passed a similar bill asking big tech to pay for news. Both Google and Meta pushed back. Facebook even banned news services for some time. But eventually, both companies came around. They've signed 30 commercial deals with news publishers since then, and the Australian government has called it a success. So there is still hope for Canada. But what about the broader picture? If Australia and Canada can do it, why not other countries? And it's a valid question. At the heart of this puzzle is the revenue model. And don't run away, I promise to keep it simple. Most news publishers need ad revenue to survive. But for ads, you need traffic. And for traffic, You need more people to visit your website or see your videos. Enter Google and Meta. These companies link you to news websites. For example, go to Google and search for the coronation. Google will show you a list of all the articles. Without Google, you would have never found them. These links can actually be counted. Google linked people to Canadian publishers 3.6 billion times in the last year. Facebook, 1.9 billion times. This led to free marketing worth around $230 million. Facebook says that money should be enough. They're providing traffic, so why should they pay more? I'll tell you why. Because despite all the so-called free marketing, it's still a raw deal for news websites. I agree it's a give-and-take relationship, but big tech is taking a lot more than it's giving. Some social media companies are trying to change this. Twitter, for one. Elon Musk has announced that users will have to pay for news. Like pay per view, it will be pay per click. News companies can charge per article. It's an idea whose time has come, we say. Google and Meta benefit from people's interest in news. When Russia attacks Ukraine, or when King Charles gets his crown, where do people go? They go to the internet to read about it. We as journalists supply people with the information they want. It is for our content that people are Googling. So it's only fair that the revenue be shared. Now let's turn our focus to Nepal. It's a small Himalayan nation of about 30 million people. It's wedged between two highly populated behemoths, India and China. Nepal is prized for its labor force, among other things, specifically its military manpower. We're talking about the famed Gorkha regiments. From the days of British colonization, the Gorkha people of Nepal and India have made a name for themselves as able warriors. It's honestly a mixture of martial traditions, job opportunities, and a hint of British racist thinking. But that mixture has resulted in a legendary reputation for the famed Gorkha regiments in the Indian Army. And for years now, China has coveted this military connection. This year, China is reportedly keen on recruiting its own Gorkha regiment. And the alarming part is this: it may get the chance to do it, because Nepal's government has stalled India's annual recruitment of Gorkha troops. Why is this happening? Our next report brings you the details.
The landlocked nation of Nepal is at a crossroads. Almost literally, when looking at its geography, it sits high in the Himalayas between India and China. The nation of 30 million is heavily dependent on its neighbors for everything from supplies to employment. Where do the Nepalis seek jobs outside their country? In a variety of fields, but there is one historical employment avenue: the Indian Army. The Indian Army has something called the Gorkha regiments. These were created during the British Raj. The British had a racist trope about martial races that could be used to fill their colonial armies, and the Gorkhas were considered a prominent martial race. Gorkha people from both Nepal and India were recruited. After India became independent in 1947, there was a question about the Gorkha regiments. What would be done with them? Nepal, India and Britain came up with the tripartite agreement. Under it, the UK retained 4 Gorkha regiments. India kept 6. And Nepal's Gorkha people would be readily recruited by the two nations. 7 decades later, Gorkha troops still hold a place of honor in the Indian Army, and deservedly so. Over the course of decades, the Gorkha regiments have proved invaluable. They have served with distinction during all of India's wars. Of course, it isn't a one-way street. The Indian Army recruiting Gorkha soldiers has helped Nepal too. It provides employment for rural areas. Retired soldiers earn a good pension. The Indian Army runs a welfare organization for its former troops as well. Overall, it's a time-tested way to maintain good economic and social ties between the two countries. But this hallowed tradition may be at risk. This year, Nepal might not send Gorkha troops to the Indian Army. The government in Kathmandu has stalled recruitments. The reason they've given is India's Agnipath scheme. It's a new armed forces recruitment scheme brought in by the Indian government last year. Under this, recruits will have a trial period of sorts for 4 years. After that, only a fourth of the troops will be absorbed into the Indian Army. The Indian government brought this scheme to try and curb its armed forces pension bill. But it means there's no guarantee that Nepal's famed Gorkha troops will get a job. This has upset Kathmandu, so Gorkha regiment recruitments have been stopped. But you may wonder, 1 out of 4 recruits is still better than none. Why would Nepal halt the entire process? Well, the answer might be Nepal's northern neighbor. China has been eyeing Gorkha regiments of its own for years, but Beijing's past attempts were always rebuffed. In 2020, Beijing conducted studies to see why Nepal's youth were drawn to the Indian army. In particular, it wanted to know what the compensation was like. China has been trying to woo Nepal's government as well. It's steadily investing in Nepal and facilitating trade and technology. And now, with the Agnipath spat, China's time may finally have come. The entire scenario may end with Beijing finally getting its own Gorkha troops. And that would be a blow to India-Nepal ties. It would be a great shame for Indian and Nepali Gorkha regiments to one day face off against each other.
Now imagine a child, barely 10 years old, sweeping the floor at a restaurant, toiling away in the dead of night. What image comes to your mind? Or rather, where do you picture this happening? In the United States of America? Because that's where this report comes from. Two 10-year-olds were found working in a McDonald's franchise. 10-year-olds were found cleaning the store, operating cash registers and serving food, sometimes as late as 2 a.m. It's the latest child labor abuse scandal coming out of America. A few days back, we told you how American states are loosening child labor laws. They're making it easier for companies to employ children and pay them less. And incidents like this are the reason why. US companies are increasingly violating child labor laws, and state governments are making it easier for them to do so. They're trying to protect companies from child labor fines. This story about the 10-year-olds comes from the state of Kentucky. A McDonald's franchisee there was found violating a host of child labor laws, and they weren't the only ones. More than 300 children were being exploited by just 3 firms here. All of them were McDonald's franchisees. They let minors operate machinery prohibited for children. They had them work beyond permissible hours, sometimes even during school hours. This violates all American federal laws about employing children. The laws clearly state that work must be permitted outside of school hours. Work must be performed, rather, outside of school hours. And children cannot work more than 3 hours on a school day. They cannot work more than 18 hours in total during a school week. The US Labor Department came out with a statement. A local official said, and I'm quoting, "Too often employers fail to follow the child labor laws that protect young workers. Under no circumstances should there ever be a 10-year-old child working in a fast food kitchen around hot grills, ovens, and deep fryers." And what are the consequences for such employers? Well, fines usually. In this case, the fine was hefty. The 3 McDonald's franchisees have to pay over $212,000. The firm employing the 10-year-olds will pay about $40,000. If they pay, that is. Because the franchisee is refuting the charges. It says the 10-year-olds were the children of a night manager, and that their parent brought them to work without informing the management, which does not really explain all the other child labor violations, more than 300, or the fact that these children were allowed to operate dangerous equipment. The Department of Labor official has said further, and I quote, "We are seeing an increase in federal child labor violations, including allowing minors to operate equipment or handle types of work that endangers them or employs them for more hours or later in the day than federal law allows." Let me show you some numbers. In 2022, the number of children working hazardous jobs went up by 26%. Illegal instances of employing minors was up by 37%. Penalties over child labor went up by 29%. So basically, child labor violations are on the rise in America. Companies are exploiting children. What's their excuse? Labor shortage. US companies cannot find enough cheap labor, so they're going after children. It's the same story across states and industries, and firms continue to break the law. The worst part is that some states are making it easier for companies to get away with all of this. And let me repeat, all of this is happening in the US. And it's not like child labor is unique to America. It's most likely worse in many other countries. But for a country that loves to lecture others on human rights and child rights and all kinds of rights, America is living in a glass house. Do you know what's common between model Hailey Bieber and former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro? No, I'm not talking about their love for slick hair. I'm referring to their connection with controversy. It's like soap operas with a flavor of hypocrisy, and sometimes it's plain hilarious. For the sake of this story, let's just focus on Bolsonaro. His home has been raided, his cell phone has been seized, and his aides have been arrested because while he says he never got vaccinated, his documents say otherwise. Now, Bolsonaro is a long-time anti-vaxxer. So did he forge his documents? And if he did, he won't be the first politician to have done it. It's just that his timing is bad. Our next story tells you why. Jair Bolsonaro is the former president of Brazil. He is in trouble again because he's being investigated again. And this time, he's being accused of deceiving America. Horror of horrors. What are we talking about? Let's spill the tea. But buckle up, it's quite the roller coaster. When the pandemic was at its peak, the US had a bunch of travel restrictions. One of them included being vaccinated against the Wuhan virus. Now, Bolsonaro wanted to travel to America, but there was a problem. He was a complete anti-vaxxer. He calls the Wuhan virus a little flu. He's been accused of spreading misinformation too, both about the vaccine and the virus.
At 65 years old, I got COVID and I took hydroxychloroquine. On the next day, I was cured. Staying at home is not the solution. Stay at home those who have pre-existing conditions, the elderly, until we wait for something concrete. All the rest, the people need to work.
But we'll tell you who needs to do the work. Bolsonaro himself. Because looking at the kind of information he's spreading, he clearly has some reading to do. But that aside, let's cut to this week. Brazil's Supreme Court released a couple of documents, and this is where the drama begins. These documents show that Bolsonaro got vaccinated, even though he has always been against the vaccination and said that he will never get it. So obviously, he's now under fire. The police have raided his home, they've confiscated his phone, they've arrested 6 people, including his close aide and security guards, because Bolsonaro is under investigation, being suspected of forging his vaccination documents. Police says it happened sometime between November 2021 and December 2022, only to sidestep the US travel restrictions. What does Bolsonaro have to say about this?
My mobile phone has been seized. My phone has no password. I will make that very clear. I have nothing to hide. Not only about the vaccination card, I have nothing to hide about anything.
Nothing to hide about anything. It has a nice ring to it, right? Fun fact, this is Bolsonaro's reaction to almost all the probes against him. Yes, there are multiple, about half a dozen criminal investigations into his activities, but he pleads innocent. The only problem is, this investigation may finally tip the scales against him, simply because this is really bad timing. Bolsonaro returned to Brazil only last month after his self-imposed exile and quickly re-entered politics. If convicted, he won't be able to run for president. And even if he isn't, this is bound to hurt his image further. Question is, how far will he go to protect his ideology and at what cost? Bolsonaro is known for digging his heels. And if he did commit this fraud to escape a vaccine, we say this stubbornness is more suited to a child. The only problem is, children do not have to fight national elections. Now let's turn our attention to space and, ironically, the lack of space within it. We're talking about stars, especially aging ones. They aren't too friendly. They despise making space for their neighbors. As they grow older, they increase in size. Eventually, they swell so much that nearby planets do not have enough room to exist. And they're swallowed whole by stars. Not very cordial behavior, is it? But our scientists are all for the dramatics in space. And for the first time ever, they've caught a star in the act. I know it sounds like fun, but it is a gloomy trailer for what is to come. Because our star, the Sun, will do the same to our planet, the Earth, at some point. Here's a report.
Have you ever used public transport during the busy hours of the day? If yes, you know all about making room for fellow passengers. There's a lot of squishing and adjusting. It can be frustrating. You're asked to move a little here and shift a bit over there, despite a clear lack of space on the bench. In that moment, does an angry thought cross your mind? Maybe you want to snap at the pushy person. Maybe you want to avoid eye contact. But do you ever want to swallow them whole? Eat them up? Not really, right? At least we hope not. Because on this planet, we treat each other with respect. Or let's just say that we try. But this is not how things work in space, especially when it comes to the stars. They don't care much for the sociable behavior of mere earthlings. They're called stars for a reason. So when there's a lack of space, they actually do swallow their fellow neighbors. This specifically happens with aging stars. Over time, they continue to swell. Eventually, their size becomes so huge that nearby planets begin skimming the surface. And this process is not without tension, because it involves exploding balls of gas, the stars. So when the planets start getting close to their host star, streams of gas and dust are sent into space. There's an intense burst of light, and finally, the planets are plunged into the star. This doesn't sound like good news for the food, right? Sorry, we mean the planets. After all, they're being eaten to death. But the stars, they get quite happy, and they shine with joy. Literally, after swallowing planets, they become much brighter, about 100 times in just about 10 days. This is a fascinating concept, and for the first time ever, scientists have witnessed it. They caught a star in the act. They didn't just see it take a nibble or a bite, they saw it swallow a planet whole. The planet looked like a gas giant. It was around the size of Jupiter, but that was before. Now, it's just, well, star food. But as fun as this tale of a star's lunchtime sounds, scientists say this is also a warning, a gloomy preview of what's to come. Because don't forget that we have a star of our own, the Sun. And as nice as it is, with all its heat and light, it can't help but be a star. There may be love between the Earth and the Sun, but they are star-crossed lovers. Eventually, the Sun will morph into a red giant, and it'll gobble at least 3 planets in our solar system: Mercury, Venus, and Earth. So being eaten by the Sun will be the final fate of the Earth. If you're worried, we totally get it. But if it's any consolation, that day is billions of years away. At least 5 billion years to be exact. Until then, we can continue to bask in the sunlight, with the quiet knowledge that it belongs to our Death Star. Yes, you guessed it, that's a Star Wars reference. We couldn't help it. After all, today is Star Wars Day. So when it comes to our sun eating up our planet, may the Force be with us.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with East Africa, Rwanda and neighbouring Uganda are facing floods. These two countries have been experiencing heavy rain since late March. In China, a heavy sandstorm has hit Xinjiang. It limited visibility and created a sand wall of sorts. Meanwhile, Russian cosmonauts performed a spacewalk to relocate an experiment airlock. Anytime an astronaut gets out of a vehicle while in space is called a spacewalk. And finally, what makes the 4th of May significant? We're taking you back in history. On this day, Margaret Thatcher became the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The year was 1979. The Labour Party's government had collapsed. The UK was experiencing economic difficulties. Public opinion had swung in favour of the Conservatives, and Thatcher hit the nail right on the head. She promised to revive the economy by increasing taxes and balancing the budget. Now they call it Thatcherism. A Soviet journalist called her the Iron Lady, and while Thatcher evokes positive emotions from young Conservatives, she remains a divisive figure in the UK. Some see her as a Prime Minister who saved the country's economy. Others believe she destroyed livelihoods. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
There it goes.
Okay. All right. Bye bye. Just flies beautifully.
Form a new administration, and I have accepted. It is, of course, the greatest honor that can come to any citizen in a democracy.
Exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.